Here's something to think about all the time. If you're 20 years old, you're basically only like 5 years old, which means you've only lived about 8% of your life so far. And that means you have about 92% of your life left, which is quite a lot. And the way that this works is you only really start living, you start making your own decisions, you start kind of exercising your free will, you start really taking control of your actions between the ages of 10 and 16 years old. I think like 15 years old is a pretty decent estimate, but I mean there's a reason why in a lot of cultures, in fact the vast majority of cultures around the world, we've picked 18 years old for a reason to be the age of consent, right? It's because that's the age that we can kind of widely agree that that's pretty much where we know almost for sure that like you're in full control, right? You're making your own decisions. You're capable of consenting. You're capable of essentially being aware of the decisions that you're making and the consequences and all of that, right? And there's a very real sense in which, like, when you think about it, when you're 5 years old, you're kind of like asleep. You're not really living your life, right? You're not aware of every decision you're making. You're not every step that you take, like whenever you decide like, oh, should I eat the cookie, you're not pausing and having self-awareness and being like, shall I make this decision and what's going to happen next, and being able to think through, right? Like you're kind of just asleep. And there's a very real sense in which like you might as well be asleep completely until you're like 10 to 12 or so, and then you slowly start to get more self-awareness in a sense. And then by the time I would say like you're 15 to 16, you're pretty much, most people at least, are probably mostly self-aware, and they're kind of thinking through their decisions and they're kind of in control, and it's almost like they can access their free will more often. In a sense, you're not really on autopilot anymore, at least not as much. And I've found, at least that's my experience, that the older I get, the less I am on like autopilot mode. And especially in my late 20s, I've found myself more and more being self-aware like 90% of the time, in a sense, at least whenever I'm making a decision, or any kind of relevant decision at all. Like I feel like I'm self-aware, and I'm in that mode of self-awareness. Like when you're giving a PowerPoint presentation and then you kind of you have that thought of like, shit, I'm giving a PowerPoint presentation. And it's like you enter manual breathing mode in a sense, but it's like manual self-awareness mode, like manual free will mode. And there's a big difference between that and just almost like autopilot, right? Which I think we can all agree that when you're 5, you're pretty much on autopilot, right? You're not in like this full self-awareness mode. And to me, at least, who knows, maybe my brain developed weirdly, but like, I feel like that's kind of the mode that I was in, at least certainly until I was like 10 or so. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have any memories from before I was 10 or from when I was 10. Obviously, I do have a lot of memories, but I don't think I was truly self-aware of every decision that I was making and thinking through every single step and thinking through the long term, right? And having that like meta awareness, right? It's not just like you kind of think through a decision, but it's like you think through the fact that you're thinking through the decision, right? And it's not just like, if I eat the cookie, mom will be mad, but it's like, okay, but then what happens if mom gets mad, and how am I going to deal with that? And am I going to feel sad if mom gets mad at me? And can I control that sadness? And like having all of these second, third level thoughts, I couldn't really do that as a 5-year old. I don't think most people can. And so my point here is, with this entire video, is kind of like, I feel in a sense that I only really started like living my life when I turned like 15 or 16 or so. Again, like, it's a slow process. It's not the one day you wake up, it's like, now I'm self-aware. I woke up from the matrix, like disconnected my brain from the autopilot. Like that's not how this works, right? But I feel like around 16 or so is probably where I became kind of like truly capable of being really aware and making more like real long-term decisions, and actually aware of truly understanding the consequences of my actions in a sense. And even then, I was still doing a lot of based on emotion and autopilot. But anyway, so my point is, I'm estimating that like you really only started living your life when you're around 15 or so. And all the years before that, they're kind of mostly a blur, and they're mostly on autopilot. So what happens is when you're 20, you've only really lived like 5 years of your life, roughly, right? Because it's like 20, Jesus Christ. Because it's like 20, got to do it slowly, my computer's glitching. When you're 20, you've lived roughly like 5 years, right? From the time you're 15 or so, give or take. So actually, it's 20 minus 15 equals 5 years that you have actually lived. And then what this means here below is that if you're going to live to about 75, then you take out the 15 years that you're mostly like just on autopilot, then you're going to have 60 years of actual like self-aware, in control, a woke existence, right? Conscious life. Like if you're going to have like 60 years of conscious life and you've only really lived 5 years so far, then that means that you've only lived 5 years of the 60 years of conscious life that you have. So that means you've only really experienced like 8% of the conscious life that you're going to have. So you have 92% of your life left. And so it's very interesting because like when you really think about that, that means that someone who's 40, they have lived, right, 40 minus 15, because you're removing the autopilot years. So that means they've lived 25 years. So it's like very weird because there's a very real sense in which someone who's 40 has lived for 25 years of like conscious life. Someone who's 20 has lived for 5 years. So it's like someone who's 40, they have 25 years of like lived experience. And someone who's 20 has only 5 years. So it's like someone who's 40 has 5 times the amount of lived experience of like conscious life. So it's very interesting. Like when you think about that, it's like that's a big difference. And so when you think about it, like someone who's 40, they're not twice the age of someone who's 20. It's not 40 versus 20. It's more like 25 versus 5. And so the person who's 40 is actually like 5 times older, which is actually kind of insane, at least in the sense of like wisdom or lived experience or something like that. Now, yeah, that doesn't mean that every 40-year-old is 5 times more mature than a 20-year-old. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying, like, all I'm saying is if you're 20, you're actually really fucking young and you have so much of your life left. So just be optimistic, like look at it like that. I remember when I turned 21, it was actually horrible, dude. Like, because I remember thinking, wow, like, especially when I turned 20, I remember thinking, like, the 1 changed to a 2, right? From 19 to 20, 19 changes to 20, and like the 1 changes to a 2. And I remember thinking, like, fuck, like, I'm kind of like halfway to 40. That's crazy. And then when I turned 25, I was like my mid 20s. Oh my God. And then when I turned 26, I was like, I'm in my late 20s in a sense, right? I'm like over the halfway point to 30. So I was like, oh my God, I'm in my late 20s, bro. Like, I'm going to fucking die soon. But like in a real sense, I've only had like 10 years. Like when I was 26, I only had like 10 years of true like self-aware life out of the 60 that I'm going to get if I die at 75. So like at 25, I was at like 16%, like 1/6 of my life. So I was at like 16% of my life. So anyway, I hope this makes sense to you guys. This is something that has really helped me just be a little more forgiving with myself, especially when I was in my early 20s. Just having the thought of like, I've only lived for like 6 years, you know? Anyway, all right. Take care, guys. Cheers.